Dear participants, my name is Verena Wieland and I am happy to welcome you to our WHU webinar series Business in a Post-Corona World in the name of our WHU Executive Education Programs. It is my pleasure to announce today's speaker, Marko Reimer, Director of the Institute of Management Accounting and Control here at WHU Otto Beisheim School of Management, with his webinar, How Finance Professionals See the Crisis. A warm welcome to you, Marko. Before Professor Reimer will start with his presentation, let me quickly share some housekeeping announcements with you. You may have noticed that your microphone is muted and your camera is switched off by default. This is due to the fact that we are expecting a large audience today and we would like to ensure the quality of the webinar. Nevertheless, we would of course like to encourage you to interact with us. Professor Reimer will first give his presentation, but then afterwards has dedicated some time to answer your questions. If you look at the lower menu bar, you see an icon that says Q&A or F&A in the German version. If you click on that item, a new window opens and you can put your questions to Professor Reimer into that window. We will then share your questions with him after his presentation. One final remark from my side, this video will be recorded and the recording will be made available to all of you afterwards. After having said this, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you, Marko.
Thank you very much, Verena, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this presentation on how finance professionals see the crisis. I'm very happy that I have the opportunity to be part of this interesting WHU series in which we really kind of try to understand and try to make sense of what's going on out there with regard to the corona crisis and their societal as well as economical implications. And I would like to dedicate 20 to 30 minutes to confront you or to share with you some of the results that we recently gained during two surveys that we conducted. And I would like to use the empirical findings as a kind of food for thought on the one hand, but also as a basis for our discussion. And I'm very much looking forward to it because I'm afraid just in terms of expectation management, I'm afraid that I will present more questions than answers to you. But I hope that we will have an interesting and as interactive as possible discussion to really kind of understand a little bit better at the end of the day what this crisis is all about and how we can effectively manage this situation. So in terms of the agenda, I will just give you a short introduction. Why is it actually an interesting question, how finance professionals see the crisis? So why should we care about how finance professionals see the crisis? I will give you a little introduction, a little motivation on the fact why we came up with these flash surveys that I will present then. And especially I would like to focus on two parts of our results here. The general impact of the crisis on companies. And the second one, how the crisis is also changing the way we think and do management control. And I will then conclude with just a very short summary. So let me start with the big picture. What we see is that from a threat of personal lives to a threat of organization, we, over the last couple of weeks, have seen many developments that we focus very much on health issues. And now in the public discourse, we see more and more also discussions going on with regards to the economic implications. And of course, it's not corona, and the coronavirus is not a health crisis anymore, but it's becoming more and more also an economic crisis. And this this goes hand in hand with challenges for employees, managers, but also politicians. And just to give you kind of just some pictures here to the left, I think everybody can somehow connect to what's going on. Closed restaurants, work-life a challenge in terms of how to be productive in home office and so on and so forth. So there are many challenges right now across the society, and in addition to that, there are quite unclear understandings about the implications for society and economy with regard to the lockdown that we see. But also, it's not just the vague understanding of the implications in terms of magnitude, but also in terms of timeline. When do we expect to rebound? When do we expect that things become better again, maybe normal again? So I will touch a couple of those questions, and I just want to give you a little motivation why we did this study. And now finally, why finance professionals? Well, we think that controllers, chief financial officers, senior managers in the finance function of an organization usually have a quite good understanding about the figures, about the financials, and about what's going on in a firm. And we thought that this would be also a very important and insightful key informant for our studies. Therefore, we asked CFOs and controllers. Now, this survey was done in a regular and kind of, we used basically two data sources. So one data source was the WHU controller panel. In this panel, many controllers, heads of controlling management accounting departments and CFOs, senior financial professionals are part of this WHU controller panel. And we do surveys with these WHU controller panelists on a regular basis, 3 times a year. And due to Corona, we did 2 additional studies. And our usual studies, our usual surveys, as well as the 2 flash studies that I would like to focus on today, has been conducted in close collaboration with the International Controller Association, which is an association that is around for many years now, has over 6,000 members by now, mainly in the German-speaking area, but also above and beyond this. And this strong collaboration is going on now for many years, and that was the second pillar of our of the data source that we could use. So basically, we targeted controllers and CFOs across many organizations that are part of our WHU controller panel. And just that you get a rough understanding how the respondents, what kind of position the respondents have. We have 20% of the respondents have a CFO position. Roughly half of them are heads of controlling departments, heads of management accounting departments, and roughly 30% are controllers, management accountants. And we did 2 studies. I just mentioned that already. So the one was at the end of March, and the other one was just 2 weeks ago, a couple of days ago, in May. And as you can see here, the first wave in March, we had the number of participants were close to 500. And in the May survey, we had 300 and close to 340 participants. Now, in terms of characteristics of the firms, we see that roughly 50%, the half of all the respondents are employed in larger firms, rather large firms with 50 million, medium-sized firms with 50 million up to 1 billion in revenues. We have 1/4 large firms, more than 1 billion of revenues, and we have small firms, also 1/4 with up to 50 million in revenues. That just gives you also a mix in terms of company size. And with regard to industry mix, you can see that a little bit more than half of our respondents are employed in manufacturing firms, 38% in service providers, and 7% of the firms represent the trade sector here. So that should give you a little overview of the people and the characteristics of the firms that engaged in our two studies here. Now, if you want to kind of have a second read maybe, or need a reference to the results that I'm going to show you now, we also published a few key facts already in the Handelsblatt. The first study was published on March 31 in the Handelsblatt, and the other one was published in May 20. So just to kind of raise your awareness in case you want to have a second look at the articles here. Now, let's start with the overarching picture. So one of the obvious questions to start a survey on the effects of Corona is, of course, ask the respondents, how much is your organization affected by the coronavirus, by the current crisis? So that was the question that we asked. And most of our questions we ask on a 7-point Likert scale. So if you have the opportunity to check the box at 1, that means not at all, we are not affected at all, and up to 7 to a very large degree, very strongly affected by the Corona crisis. And as you can see here, 2 different bars for the March and for the May survey, and you see, first of all, there are not really that did not really change over time. So the March and the May results are pretty much the same, meaning that more or less all firms are affected across all firm sizes, across all industries. We see here a pretty much systemic crisis going on, and 1/3 of the companies responded that they are very much affected by the current crisis. And I will come to this separation here. There are a few companies not that much affected. So the companies who basically answered 1 or 2 are subgroup analysis that we did. So that are the companies that are rather little affected by the crisis, and the 6 and 7 bucket, that are the companies that are strongly affected. And I will make that comparison later on here and there. So just to for your understanding that you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about companies that are very much affected. Now, above and beyond the general, how companies are generally affected by the crisis, we also ask the respondents what they think about how severe the effect is in terms of firm survival. And what we see here is that if you see here at the right-hand side, the 6 and 7 again, roughly 10% less, a little bit less than 10% of the respondents consider that their company is very unlikely to survive. So that are the really trouble, the companies that are in a very severe situation, that they don't really see here a high likelihood of survival. While, and this is also a good news, if you look at the firms that responded that they are not affected, that their firm survival is not really at risk here, is quite high. This is the first good news, and the second good news is that if you look at the differences in the bars here from March 2020 to May 2020, you see an increase from 51% to 65%. That tells you that while in March, roughly half of all companies told us that they will most likely survive. This ratio is now even higher. It went up to 65%, so 2/3 now see not really a likelihood of that their firm survival is threatened here. We do see, though, an industry effect and a firm size effect. We see that manufacturing firms are much more affected by the with regards to firm survival than service firms. And we also see that clearly, by far, smaller firms are much more at risk than larger firms. Okay, so that gives you a rough picture of the general crisis situation and how the firms that we surveyed are affected by the crisis. Now, an interesting finding is listed here. We looked at the change in the relevance of the crisis symptoms. And we came up with 5 crisis symptoms in our March survey. We looked at how difficult are the working conditions for your employees with regards to hygiene issues, with regards to no meetings, with regard to home office, and so on and so forth. We also looked, of course, at decline in sales, restrictions with regard to production, unstable supply chains, and also liquidity issues in terms of bottlenecks here with regard to cash. And I would like to draw your attention to 2 things here. First of all, if we compare the results from March to May, we see that although the difficult working condition is still one of the top crisis symptoms here, what we see is that firms tend to, managers tend to be very successful with reorganizing the working environment for the employees, because this is a very significant reduction as a crisis symptom. And we also see to little degree, but still we see also a reduction in the crisis symptom, or the relevance of the crisis symptom that is connected to supply chains. So it seems that also here firms manage to somehow stabilize their supply chains, because there's a reduction at both with regards to the relevance of those 2 crisis symptoms. However, we see now that the decline in sales is becoming more an issue. It's becoming much more an issue now in firms if we compare the May results with the March results. So there's now a higher impact of declining sales. And if you look at the total, not just the change from May to March or March to May, you see, if you just look at the size of the bars, you see that lack of liquidity seems to be the least important, least significant symptom of the crisis here, which is, of course, a little bit, that goes a little bit against the intuition, our intuition, my intuition at least, and it also goes a little bit against the results that you find here and there from different surveys and studies that are out there now. But maybe we will come back to that issue later on, and hopefully also in our discussion. So that tells you a little bit about how the relevance of different crisis symptoms changed over time. Now, of course, one of the most pressing questions 1 month ago, but also, of course, today is, when are we back to normal? And the answer from our respondents is more or less clear, namely, we don't know. And I just would like to share an interesting fact here. In our survey in March, we ask, when do you think, at what point in time will you see clearer? Will you have a better understanding what is actually going on? And the most respondents gave as answers in 6 weeks. So in 6 weeks, it's not saying that the crisis is over in 6 weeks, but rather saying that then we have a better understanding what's going on. We have a better understanding of the implication of this crisis situation. So, and therefore we did our second survey in May after 7 weeks. because we figured, okay, so when after the first survey, the respondents told us in 6 weeks we know better, let's ask them after 7 weeks again. And what we found here was quite surprising, namely that 60% of the respondents replied to the question, when are we back to normal? Well, we can say, we are unable to say at this point in time. There were only 4% saying that we do not expect a return to normal at all. So there will be no normal, back to normal. And 2% already give the answer that they are already back to normal. So if we look at the 1/3 of the respondents that that dare to give an estimation here, a time estimation, the median here is 8 weeks, but a rather high variance, as you can see here in the blue, light blue box. 80% of the companies are giving answers between 4 weeks and 30 weeks, and 11% actually expect the rebounds back to normal not before 2021. And I think it's really interesting maybe to also mention shortly that if you look at the very small group of companies who are stating that we do not expect a return back to normal, it's of course difficult to draw solid conclusions from this very little group here. But it's really interesting to see that most of the companies are manufacturing companies, and you can see overrepresentation of companies that are somehow related to the automotive industry here. All right. Now, with regards to investment patterns, we of course were also interested in how the investments plans and the investment strategies changed due to Corona. And the rhetoric that you find out there in the public discourse or in the newspapers and in the talk shows is that many observers, consultants, but also researchers are worried a little bit about how that companies might now cut back on investments, and that would be bad with regards to the investments that are so much needed, for example, in digitalization and sustainability or in R&D. Now, what we see here is that, of course, all companies are somehow kind of reconsidering their investment plans due to the Corona crisis. But it's interesting to see here that that roughly 50%, a little bit more than 50% of all, with regard to all different types of investments, are considered and implemented as planned prior to Corona. Right? You can see here that digitalization, for example, there's even a positive note here that even 17% of the firms are saying that we increased actually the investments in digitalization, or are now working on the implementation of those investments with a much higher priority. You can see, of course, also that companies with regard to sustainability are cutting back, or at least canceling a project partially. And here it's interesting to note that especially smaller firms are more conservative in terms of cutting back higher amounts than larger firms with regard to sustainability here. Okay, so then let's move on. Maybe this is already the first, because that was our idea here, that the investments, of course, and a reduction, a significant reduction in investment that we don't really see that much, might be one of the reasons why we don't see the liquidity issue early on that I mentioned, but there must be something else going on too. All right, then we ask for governmental support. Of course, this is a big issue now, not just in Germany, but around the world, that of course, governments are trying to help firms now to survive in these critical situations that we face here. And we ask for different aids, different tools that the government is providing. And by far, we see that short-time working allowance, what we call in Germany Kurzarbeit, this is the tool of choice for many firms. It's that out of the population that we surveyed here, 41% of all companies that answered our questionnaire basically stated that they are partly using short-time working allowance. And on rank 2, you see tax deferrals, and rank 3 are KfW loans, basically loans provided by the promotional bank of Germany. Not so surprising is the fact that, of course, the firms which are affected heavily by the crisis ask for, of course, much more government support than the firms that are not so much affected. So 75% versus 25% here, for example. And the use of government support is also driven by firm size, while 51% of small firms, 56% of medium-sized firms ask for government support. Only 38% of the larger firms with more than 1 billion in revenues ask for government support here. Now, of course, as always, there's the big discussion also going on whether there's also an opportunity, a chance that we can see in crisis situation. And we also asked our controllers and CFOs in March and also in May again, do you also think about opportunities in this crisis situation? And what you see here is that, again, on the 6 and 7 end of the continuum here, is that there's an increased number of companies, if you compare March to May, that see increasingly also opportunities in this COVID-19 crisis situation. And at the same time, which is mirrored a little bit, of course, the respondents who didn't see opportunities in March are now going down. That basically means that there is a general shift towards seeing more and more opportunities in the crisis situation. And just one of the examples of the open answers in our questionnaire, one of the respondents stated here, I think that the crisis is also injecting a new lease of life into many SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, with regards to working from home, digitalization, and so on and so forth. This was a very representative statement. Many respondents asked, well, I've never thought that we would be so quickly in implementing a home office, Zoom or Skype meetings, and so on and so forth. So there was also a very constructive push that many of our respondents saw in the crisis situation. Now, of course, I mentioned that I would also like to state a few words or kind of share some insights with you on how management control might be affected by the crisis situation. And we looked at a few characteristics of management control. For example, the way how firms do their forecasting. How did that change? And there we see a very clear picture with regard to the frequency of the forecast. So we asked basically, due to Corona, did the frequency of your forecasting change, and did you significantly reduce it? Is it unchanged, or did you significantly increase it? And here I think we can see a very clear picture, namely that 61% of the respondents of the firms that answered this question are stating that they have now a higher frequency of the forecasts, and only 3% actually reduced the frequency of the forecast. The picture is not as clear if you look at the level of detail. Here we see 41% saying that we have now a much more detailed forecast, and 23% are saying that now we have reduced the level of detail, and 36%, so roughly speaking, 1/3 of all firms didn't change their level of detail with regard to the forecast. What we can also see, looking at the answers in this management control part of the survey, is that 25%, so 1 out of 4 firms basically stating that they are steering much more with actual values, with actuals right now, than with planned values. So planned values are becoming less important, and firms tend to focus on actual values. Also, and this is, I think, also not really a surprise, given that so many firms across industries and firm size groups and so on are affected by the corona crisis, that 58% are saying that they adjusted their 2020 targets because of course the heavy impact of the corona crisis. And 11%, this goes even more into the future, so that nicely fits to the time horizons I mentioned before with regard to the bounce back, that we see that 11% of the firms suspended or postponed the upcoming budgeting process because, well, our interpretation would be due to the vague understanding how the developments will look like. Okay, and then last but not least, the range forecasts, because now what you find in nowadays is that strategy consultants, but also finance people, are really kind of put emphasis on old instruments such as scenario planning or some other instruments, stress tests, simulations, and so on and so forth. Because of course, due to Corona, we have now much higher understanding of there might be not just one future. We should think in multiple futures. We should think in scenarios. We should kind of run some sensitivity analysis and so on and so forth to get a better understanding how an impact of a Corona or similar crisis would have on our business model and on the likelihood of survival. And here again, I share some quotes with you saying that, well, there are really now, there's a push, and finance professionals, controller are asked to come up with all kinds of scenarios. They are part of crisis management teams. They are much more now part of board meetings. They have a higher exposure to the top management. Top management ask for all kinds of scenarios and stress tests here, and to a degree that the controllers and the finance people didn't think about yet. For example, so yeah, of course we did a worst case scenario, usually declining sales of 20-30%, but we never thought about dimensions of, let's say, 70%, right? So, but this is of course something that we see now, and there's also kind of a push from the top management to really ask for these kind of ideas and this kind of analysis, and this will surely, at least this is our expectation, that will lead to a revival, to a kind of revival for instruments such as scenario planning. And also, that might also be one of the reasons why controllers and finance professionals within an organization might be become more important now. I mean, there's the old saying that crisis times are good times for controllers, and in our results here, and especially also the open comments by the respondents, clearly point into exactly that direction. Now, I just would like to give you a kind of summary, and of course these are rather preliminary results and ideas, and I mentioned that already in the beginning, that I probably will raise more questions than I can deliver answers now. But I just want to kind of wrap it up shortly, saying that based on the findings, and I very much focused on the findings of our two flash studies here, we see a strong economic impact of the crisis on our firms that took part in our surveys. But we see a limited threat to firm survival. I think that's a very good news. We see a changing pattern of crisis symptoms. So firms, I think, now will have to spend lots of thoughts on how to manage the declining sales sides. While they managed very well to set up the new working environment for their employees, and also fix the supply chain, I think now the sales side will be very much in the focus of decision makers. And then high level of uncertainty among the CFOs and controllers about the time needed to return to normal. There are some critical voices even saying that there will be no back to normal. There will be somehow a new normal, but that will look quite differently to what we used to have. And last not least with regards to the management control, we see that there's an adjustment going on, that management control systems, controlling processes such as budgeting, forecasting, and eventually also reporting will be somehow adjusted to navigate through the crisis. And I think that based on my last comments, there might be a very important role for CFOs, of course, and also for controllers in this crisis management, but then also beyond, because there are a couple of things that I believe will stay, such as a clearer dedication to multiple scenarios, think about different scenarios and how they would impact the business model and the financials of a firm. And yeah, I think that's all for this point in time. I hope that was somehow insightful, and I'm very much looking forward to questions. I'm pretty sure there will be lots and lots of questions.
Thank you so much, Marko, for sharing your insights and for giving the presentation. Yes, of course, our participants ask questions, and dear participants, of course, you are invited to continue asking questions. I would like to start one related to the beginning of your presentation. If you could elaborate a little bit more on what we know about a few companies that do not expect to return back to normal.
Yeah, as I already mentioned, what we can say is that there are basically almost all of those few that don't expect to be back to normal are manufacturing firms. So not trade firms, not service providers, but manufacturing production firms, and we really could see that, especially from the automotive industry, or at least there are links to the automotive industry. That's a pattern that we can see. Other than that, it's really, I don't want to over-interpret the characteristics here, because it's as you can imagine, a rather small and goods, which is good, a rather small number of firms that are stating this clear statement here.
One participant is interested if there will be a new survey in a few months to see if there are possible differences, and what do you expect in differences here?
Yeah, of course, we would love to do another survey. It depends a little bit on how things will develop, and of course, this is heavily related also to the commitment by the controllers, CFOs, and other respondents to fill in our questionnaire, right? I mean, this is always the trade-off. Of course, new data is always good, but of course, if you get three invitations a day to be part of a survey on the economic impact of the coronavirus, then your motivation might suffer at the end a little bit. But of course, we would like to see, of course, the long-term implications. That's one thing. And luckily, we ask in our regular survey in October, November 2019 about whether the firm is in a crisis situation. And of course, the level of, if we would compare this level with the level that we have found in March and May, these are basically different cups of tea, much different, of course. And to a degree that some of the respondents were kind of saying, well, why are you asking about a crisis? Don't talk about crisis. There is no crisis, and there will be no crisis. So don't be too negative here, right? And of course, we want to see how this will then develop. And for this reason, of course, we would like to, but we have to make a call here whether we can also expect participants to fill in our survey.
Let me continue, Marko, with a couple of questions which are more of general nature. So one very important question is, do you think this situation will lead to a recession? So you're not an economist, but still probably you have an idea about this.
Yeah, that's good. That's good that you made this disclaimer. Indeed, I'm not an economist, and I rather look at the micro level of this crisis. But no, I think that of course the question that was also reflected in our survey. So when do you think will we be back to normal? That of course also implies a little bit, will we see an L in U or a V type of development in the near future? It looked, let's put it this way, when we asked our respondents in March, it very much looked rather like in V. We will have a deep dip, but then a very kind of strong rebounds. Now, since we see on the one hand this shift in the crisis symptoms on the one hand, but on the other hand, what really came to a surprise to me was that the firms tend to be not really clear about the implication. That I would interpret as a signal that it will take longer than we thought in March. So I would rather now probably, I would rather expect in U than a V.
And maybe on the notion of, well, expectations about how long this crisis will last and how much the effects are going to be. There is another question on, did at the beginning of in your first survey or in your second survey, did you get a notion that companies try to compare this situation to the financial crisis situation we had in 2008 and 2009, or was there a different understanding of this crisis and how to tackle it?
If you look at this, in this, with regard to this question, I can't really draw on our survey. But what I can tell you is that if you look at all the smart reports and predictions that are out there by all the big consultancies and thought leaders in their field, what you many times find there, and I have a particular article in mind that was published in the financial crisis 2008-2009 in a McKinsey quarterly. And if you just read the first 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences, you would feel, and if you don't know what the source is, you would feel that this was published yesterday in the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or whatever. So the descriptions of the experts in 2008-2009 about how they see the financial crisis is very closely related somehow in the wording, in the magnitude of the effect, and so on and so forth. What we would also describe, how we would also describe it today. So in that sense, I think there are parallels.
As we know, many companies were not prepared when Corona crisis hit, and most have been suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's possible to prepare for the case that something like this happens again? And how can companies prepare for such a situation? Yeah,
that's a great question. Short answer is yes. I have a clear answer there. It's yes. Companies can prepare, and that's the easy part. But how to really do it is, of course, much more difficult and complex. And I think what we and we also actually are working on solid answers to this question. And we started a research project to really understand how firms can set up resilience. And this new, not so new buzzword, if the way we see it, there are many different levers that you can pull to increase the resilience of your firm. And and there are many little things. You can talk about organizational structural resilience. You can also talk about resilient mindsets. And in that regard, the good news is there are many measures that you can take to make your company, your organization in general more resilient, and therefore being better prepared for crisis situations like this one.
Could you maybe share 1 or 2 examples?
Yeah, for example, I mean, there's the big, of course, trade-off that will always be there between being a lean organization, being very efficiency-driven on the one hand, and include here and there Slack. And if I talk about Slack, then I'm not just saying this typical financial type of Slack that should be there, but also that you really think about the detrimental effects of, for example, performance extremists. There, if your tool and controllers, of course, have the tendency to really push the efficiency and bring that to the next level. But of course, I think we will have to talk much more about the downside of being so much driven by the efficiency and whether we would kind of compromise on that to gain a little bit more robustness here and there in terms of resilience. And then, of course, I mean, talking about supply chains, and this is also, of course, then also related again to efficiency arguments. Does it make sense to rely on only one supplier, right? That might be, from an efficiency or cost perspective, this might be a smart thing to do in terms of being resilient or becoming more resilient. It might be better to have 2 or 3 suppliers, and you could go on. And at the end of the day, I think this will also give a push to the risk management, but not risk management in a compliance way that you check the boxes, but that you really think about how can you how can you really manage the risk in terms of the risk that is affecting your business model. And I'm pretty sure that there will be coming something out of our research sooner than later, and there will be something that we can share with you. Maybe we will have another webinar at some point in time. So I think there's we are on a good path already. And if you can't wait, and if you want to see or read something immediately, there's a nice piece out right now, written by my dear colleague Otto on how to become more resilient. It's in financial management, so maybe we can, for those of you who are interested, we can share the link, and then you can. I think it's open access. You can read it on the internet if you want. But there's more to come.
Thank you. We talked about different budget scenarios are realistic. What do you think how shareholders will respond to this from your point of view?
Well, I think that touches a little bit on are we willing to really learn something out of this crisis situation? And of course, as a shareholder, I would like to have a lean, efficiency-driven firm on the one hand, but also I would, of course, I think shareholder will put now a much more emphasis also on how robust companies can steer through these economic difficult times, and there will be again a little bit speculation, but I would argue that they will value it to a larger degree than they did before.
And so there is a question about cash flow. Obviously, revenues have declined quite steeply in the past couple of months, at least for many companies. This is the case. So probably cash reserves are increasingly drying out. The question is about your perspective on steering of free cash flow after the crisis. Do you expect companies to build a larger buffer of cash to handle such situations as the current one?
I would say yes. I think they will be more willing to hold larger cash, but not to a extreme extent, I would say, because one of the measures that I just mentioned that can increase your overall organizational resilience is, of course, our resources, and one part of it will be definitely cash resources. On the other hand, of course, it depends a little bit on what kind of companies you look at. If you look at the typical German Mittelstand, that already did a great job in being very on solid basis when it comes to the financing, and so I think there maybe it won't change that much there, but in general I would say that there will be a higher tendency for companies, managers, but also shareholders allowing a little bit more slack in the organization. And part of this a little bit more slack will be a cash position.
And I'm also watching the time and coming slowly to an end, but I have a very last question to you, Marko.
Yeah.
You're not only a researcher, but you're also a professor, and you're teaching bachelor students, master students, MBA students here at WHU in finance-related topics. And the question is from one of our participants today. So what do you think about the future of the finance function in terms of will there be more hiring? Will there be the finance function will become more important? And as a second question, and that's what I'm adding right now, is do you think the education of finance professionals will have or the current crisis impacts the education of finance professionals?
Well, let me start with the last part. I think yes, and I hope so. I hope so that we will see that we reconsider and rethink the way how we teach. And I'm not talking about now finance. I'm talking about management, accounting, and control. So the controlling part rather. And I think we already kind of reconsidered many things in that regard. This Corona crisis, of course, is now a new dimension to reconsider it once again. And I mentioned already some things like dealing with uncertainty, setting up an agile organization, also in finance, thinking about the mindset that is needed to become more resilient, not just the cash, not just maybe a stronger supply chain or whatever you may think of in an organizational or structural way, but also all the other things. So I think there will be, there are lots of opportunities to highlight the things that we already learned in the crisis, but also that we are going to learn going forward. I think that there will be many things we'll find also their place in lectures and in curricula. So that's the second part. The first part is on whether finance will become more important, or whether there will be more job opportunities in finance, right? Was that the question? I guess yes. Well, this is a very tough question actually, because we see so many different developments that are overlapping, and right now, as I mentioned, there's a feeling that that finance professionals and controllers are very important right now, because they can make sense out of the financials that we have. They can conduct the help of the forecasting and so on and so forth. So, but then there are other trends that are somehow, some of those trends are reinforcing each other, and somehow kind of leading to a crowding out or to a mitigation of other processes, such as digitalization, right? The question, and I have a research project right now going on, whether digitalization will lead to fewer controllers or more controllers, right? You can argue in both directions, and this is, to be very honest, a very, very difficult question, and this becomes even more difficult, because it's not just that you can think about how will the type of work or the job description change, but also whether the label for this job will remain as being a controller, as being a finance whatever, right? Or whether we will have people who are much more than into the analysis of big data, much more into the automation area, whether we will talk about much more about data scientists and other jobs. And then the question is that now a finance person or not, right? So it's really a difficult question, and it's really hard to predict. I think in general, the activities that are going on, with all the digitalization, with the change in agility, and now as a new boost, probably resilience, will leave lots of room for companies to improve in this area, and this should in general lead to probably to a higher relevance, but the impact on the job market is really difficult to estimate.
Thank you very much, Marko, for your insightful presentation, and also for answering all the questions. And with that, we're coming to a close of our webinar. And the final words belong to you, Marko.
Thank you, Rebecca. So thank you very much for this interesting discussion. And I think that as I promised in the beginning, there are lots and lots of questions that needs to be answered, and we are working on it. And if you have some kind of feedback, idea, second thought on what you've seen today here during the presentation, please touch base. Let me know. Here are my contact details, and also if you want to learn more about the controller panel, because as I already mentioned, we are doing this on a regular basis. Three times a year we are sending out surveys to the controllers across more than 1,000 organizations now, and we can really provide you with interesting, insightful benchmarks, and just have a look, and maybe if you have any questions, just let me know. I'm happy to answer. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful afternoon.